Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I'm your host, Owl Medicine, and in today's podcast, I've got a real treat for you. I have with me today Trip Om Shanti, who is a yogi, a amateur Sanskritologist, and author, and last but not least, friend. I'm really excited to let you in on the conversation that we had. It was a real joy. I hope that you enjoy this. We cover all kinds of things about trauma from kind of a Western perspective, a little bit from an Eastern perspective, just to frame, asking him about how trauma is integrated and thought of as a yogi. What has been his process? What has been his understanding as he has moved through the yogic practices and through studying the sutras, which he wrote a book on. And you can get that book on Amazon right now. Without any further ado, here is my conversation with Trip Om Shanti. All right. So I'm really happy to have you on here. I'm excited to have you as a guest on my podcast. That's a brand new thing for me, as I was mentioning. And
yeah, well, there's a lot of overlap, I find. My background is yoga and study yoga and Vaishnavism, practice of devotional bhakti towards Lord Krishna. And my journey, whether I wanted to admit it to myself or not, is basically working through your trauma in the most realistic sense possible, and identifying trauma in your practice and other people and the way we communicate, and not just with people, but with nature, how nature communicates trauma, how evolution works. It's all there. And so when I read your book, which I had the pleasure of doing recently, I see so much overlap, in the affirmations that are coming out from the research that you've made and the life you've lived, citing authors like Gabor Mate. There's so much overlap into how we identify these experiences and their effect on us. And how I also see that overlap in scripture and forms of meditation, the Yoga Sutras, these ancient Sanskrit parables that were written thousands of years ago, kind of also hitting on the same thing. But we don't use the word trauma in these words in the Sanskrit, which we could talk about later, which I find a unique take. Why we don't have that word specifically. You don't read that word if you read any old ancient text.
Oh, I find that very interesting. Could you, let's just dive into that now. So, the book, as my listeners know, because that's most of what I've been talking about for the last 3 years, is pieces in the book and then other random things about health and life. It's all about trauma. But the reason that we really wanted to have this conversation was because we connected briefly about the overlap of a few things, but especially and specifically dissociation and trauma. And to hear that trauma, that what we're talking about is basically identical, but the words that we use are different, and that's always one of the most interesting things to me, because there are only phenomena. That's all there is. There is phenomena. Mm-hmm. There are events that are the phenomena, and then everything else is the way that we describe or experience that. So I'm really interested to hear, what if they don't use trauma? How is it framed?
Yeah. Yeah, what's amazing about the word trauma is that it's like a clinically defined word, and it not only is it clinically defined, but you can also break it down into different forms of trauma and different sources of trauma. It's a study, and people dedicate their whole lives to just breaking this word apart. But if you rewind ourselves to the times when a lot of these religious scriptures are written, whether it's the Bible or anything, Sanskrit, the Upanishads, the Old Testament, they came from a time where we have limited resources in our vocabulary and our means of expressing, especially our means of dissecting the human consciousness, if you will, which I feel like you find a lot more you find a lot more taken apart in Eastern religions than you might find in older Western religions. Western religions are more story or parable based, but in Eastern religions, they'll actually break it down to the science. Like the consciousness is these 5 layers of thought. You know, you have the consciousness, which is the more like you're seeing things, hearing things with your intelligence, all the way to different layers of subconsciousness, controlling them. And then within those, these are just technical terms. They'll use words like samskara, which are imprints. You could think like grooves on a record. That imprint, you could call this trauma, or different kind of like messages, happenings that happen to us that now have scarred these memories into different layers of our consciousness. And other schools of thought, like Vedanta, you hear the word vasanas, which actually is from the Sanskrit word for perfume, which I find is a very poetic way to describe a samskara. So it's, instead of saying it's like something cut into our consciousness, it's like a perfume that wafts in and out at varying strengths that encourages us to think a certain way or desire a certain thing.
That.
But in Sanskrit, you have a language that probably kicked off around 1500, 2000 BC. Earlier, you can go earlier than that, and we'll call it Vedic Sanskrit. But Vedic Sanskrit and classical Sanskrit is like almost like 2 different languages. You could say it's like Old English to Modern English. Modern English speaker wouldn't understand Old English, only partially.
Right.
Pick out some words in there, and there's a few words that remain, but mostly it would be indistinguishable. So we'll ignore Vedic Sanskrit, just jump into classical Sanskrit. Classical Sanskrit lasted at least over 2,000 years of its publishing era, kind of capping off around 1500 AD. After that, a couple books were written just as a tribute to it, but it wasn't really a widely used publishing language, if you will.
Right.
And if anything came out with Sanskrit after that, either it was in this special time period where it just got written, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, I think, was dated around 1700s. These are like exceptions to the rules. Or you have people who are writing translations to a different language and they're noting a Sanskrit book. So we'll just say Sanskrit kind of ended as a language around that time period. When you have a language that stretches for that much time, you really need a dictionary for almost every 200-year period. And you could think English, like think of it like
Right.
It's the 1800s right now. People spoke a way different English back then. They used totally different vernacular
Yeah, I remember
that we would never use.
I remember a stat from some etymology thing that was talking about how it's like we lose 1.5 words every 2 years or something in a living language that a modern population is speaking, that we lose like a 1.5 words every 2 years because of just...
That's really sad. I'm gonna pour a glass of orange juice on the floor for the words that didn't make it this year. You know, I feel bad. I should have a proper burial.
We
what
should.
I'm suggesting. Yeah.
Oh,
that's very interesting.
I want to come back to the thing. So, what would give me the word? It wasn't sankara, but what was the word for scar, and then what was the word for perfume that you were talking about, and that they were using rather than?
It's the vasana.
Vasana was the perfume.
Vasana is perfume.
Okay.
And samskara is like the imprint.
Samskara. Okay. That's
which is interesting. Now I'm thinking about it because these words break down.
Yeah, and it's describing. It's more accurately describing the event, because one, like the samskara that's talking about the event itself, that imprinted, the thing that left the imprint, the conditioning, whether that was traumatic conditioning or non-traumatic conditioning, the imprint is the imprint. But then if it's traumatic, that imprint has a smell and it wafts like in Chinese medicine, we have a similar concept when illnesses come and go, or when pain comes and goes, or when pain moves around the body, we call it wind. And there's a number of different things that can attribute to wind, but if there is any pain and it moves around the body, it's a form of wind. But I like that there's a term specifically for the event, and then there's a term for the lingering effects. Because for me, and writing a book on trauma, the lingering effects are what most of us are talking about when we're talking about our trauma. We're not talking about the samskara, we're not talking about the samskara. We're not talking even about the imprint or even the event. We're talking about that triggerable status that our nervous system lives in. And we're talking about those moments when the perfume gets a little too heavy. That's
Exactly. Both of them actually are widely quoted in two different respective cultures of Sanskrit, and they both roughly refer to the same thing. So you said that one of them is like the action, one of them is the event. Both of them are kind of that role in their respective things. So like in Vedantism, I'll hear a lot of vasana. A lot of the scriptures they have there, we'll use that word. And then in Vaishnavism and Bhakti, I'll hear samskara a lot. But I'm sure you might even see both in both. Or it's just the era of Sanskrit that they attribute their Sanskrit, they call it from.
Yeah,
they use that word. And that's the part that I wanted to get to that I find interesting is because you would need a dictionary for every 100 years of Sanskrit. And we don't do that with any kind of dictionary you could find in Sanskrit. What you do is you have a dictionary, a Sanskrit dictionary. There's websites that are pulled together by the Sanskritologists of the world that are basically all 3,000, 2,000 years of published literature in one book. And it's like a soup, if you will, because you can't just say like, oh, he said, samskara, like, what does that mean? It could mean just samkara. It could mean like something that's equal the doer, kara. It depends what year you're in. Like tamas, for example, means originally means darkness in Vedic Sanskrit. And then as it got to classical Sanskrit, it started to mean ignorance. It meant like it's more poetic. And what this means with trauma is that trauma is, to me, what all of these things were pointing at, whether it was samskaras or vasanas or dukkha, which just means suffering. You see this a lot in the Bible too. Just suffering and pain. The more poetic, story-based parables about like why we hurt. And how Jesus is here to reveal that to us. And really what it comes down to is this clinical definition of trauma and how we're affected by it, how we work through it. And I got to see that firsthand when I started practicing yoga as a physical asana, because as a physical movement, you're working through the physical triggers of your pain. And that doesn't have to be like what you called in your book like a Hollywoodized version of capital T trauma, I think you call it. That's what everyone thinks. I remember when I was telling people I was going through these experiences, people were like, yeah, but you were never like, you were never like abused when you were a kid or something like this, but there was a constant trauma. I grew up with an alcoholic father. Not to say that, I deserve my capital T, if you will. But I had these experiences that triggered some very real consequences in my life, like autoimmune disorders and all sorts of issues that I've inherited because of that. And when I practiced the physical yoga, I was confronting them, and not as an event like, oh, this one time I never resolved this one moment when I was a kid, nothing like that, but rather just this general personality that I inherited and how I trigger myself to these little T moments, as you call them, and how they collectively create me if I want to be that person or not. So now I can choose, at a higher precipice, do I want to identify with this or not? So that was my great affirmation, my aha moment while reading your book. It's like, I've done this too. And
well, and that's what's so awesome about yoga and movement is trauma. Like, I really find that analogies and parables and things are genuinely the best way to communicate. You can be as specific as you want, but unless somebody has the like exact same like bent towards specificity that you do, analogies work really well. And our trauma, they're a lot of times it feels like a really a bratty teenager or a horrible boss or these like those big deals that you don't want to deal with. And so the most like sometimes we realize that the best way to deal with something is indirectly. Like if you know so-and-so hates you and you really need to get something done, you can ask I had siblings growing up. So like you'd have your siblings go ask mom if you could like leave the room or whatever. And I feel like yoga does that so well because when we think of trauma, at least in the West, when we think of trauma, we think of the psychological scars that it leaves us with. And so, and with our very one-to-one reductionistic like way of doing thinking and science and whatnot in the West, then we automatically go, okay, a psychological problem needs a psychological fix. And that's just not it in a lot of cases. I really see this. I see it working so much better for people to have an indirect approach because like whatever psychological thing happened created a very real physiological analog in all of us. That is that imprint, and dealing with what we're dealing with when our trauma is triggered and the perfume starts wafting is physiological in its basis. And when you trace back brains and nervous systems evolutionarily all the way before human beings, brains evolved for one purpose, and it was locomotion. Movement was the very first commandment for brains. Movement was. That's why the nervous system was created. And I feel like these indirect approaches, like having a regular movement practice where you can face being uncomfortable and you can face like, okay, well, I smoked too much weed and ate too many cookies last night, and now I can't get like my twist isn't as far as it used to be, and being like, okay, and accepting that and going as far as you can that day and moving on, you know? There's such a wisdom in that. And so much of the wisdom to me is because of the indirectness, which is really funny for me as a person who I pride myself on being very direct. But the older and wiser I get, I'm finding that an indirect approach works really well for certain things. And I think trauma is definitely one of those. It lives actively in our nervous systems every day, and it is what keeps us triggerable, for lack of a better word. And having a physical practice that you go to every day or multiple times a week that you can kind of, and that's why the only kind of the only kind of yoga I've really enjoyed was Ashtanga, because it was exactly the same every time. So I could just like memorize that, and that's your fault, because I'd never done any yoga until your class. I'd never been to a yoga class in my life until yours in Barcelona. Wow. From that day forward, the only yoga I've really done since then is Ashtanga, because for me there was something about doing the same thing every time, because I am not a routine person. Not even close. I really wish that I was. I understand and have felt the power of routines, but Ashtanga,
that's really surprising.
That I don't do routines.
Yeah, you don't do routines, but you end up getting committed to one of the most routine practices that you could think of.
Yeah, and it's and that's why is I guess I don't do routines well, but I do obsessive well. And then maybe that's why. Maybe that's
there you
why.
Go. That's actually it.
Yeah, because it really helped to be able to just do the same thing every time and let my brain turn off and just be with my body and not have to think about what movement I'm doing next or listen to what movement I'm supposed to do next or what breath is supposed, like none of that. It just did the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. And it was, and it was amazing. And like you said,
I think it has a lot to do with the architecture.
Oh, the architecture?
The architecture of consciousness, I think, is built upon a physical stature. Just like we were saying, evolutionarily, our bodies existed before our brains did. And so, on that note, anecdotally speaking, I believe that we are a physical, emotional being first, and then we're a speculative being later. And so when we get affected by anything, particularly like traumas or even not traumas, just any kind of conditioning, I think that conditioning, the stuff that lasts, it is in a physical body of ours. And that's where we inherit it, it's where we hold it. And I think speculation is great for becoming aware of it and noticing it there. But this could just be me speaking, because I understand there's a lot of people that find a lot of help from talk therapy. So I don't want to discredit that advantage that they have. At least I know for me, I'm already super heady guy. So, and I feel like I'm very aware, as much as I can be aware of myself intellectually. I almost like beg for new books to pop up on the nonfiction shelves, just to be like, maybe there's something I don't know yet, you know. But physically is like an ocean to me. To be able to like look at what I call the fingerprint of the breath, you know, that within a single breath, you should be able to register someone's entire life from just the texture of how they exhale, or the tension in their inhalation should tell you their childhood and their traumas. Everything should be within that one breath. And for me, I've been able to discover quite a lot within that, but it's still an ocean to me. And within that ocean, as shallow as I've swam, I've been able to uncover so much of my own profile and what makes me me, and be able to let go of sides of that through the practice, which is interesting.
Yeah, because I agree. I think we are speculative beings dead last. And I think evolutionary, like from an evolutionary biology perspective, I don't think you could come to any other conclusion. Like our conscious, and people talk about like the conscious mind, and we only use like 10% or 5% of our conscious mind. And my immediate thought every time is like, do you know how expensive consciousness is? Like, to be able to command your attention and your awareness on a biological level, do you have any idea how expensive that is? It is so expensive.
How can you afford in this economy?
Exactly. Like, people, we've got to understand that our bodies are an ecosystem. It is like 1 out of every 100 cells in us is actually human. We are an ecosystem, and it's so expensive. So of course we're only using we're only using 10% of our conscious brain. And it's like, I think you have that backwards. I think where it's like consciousness is only taking up 10% of the brain maximum, because any more than that is really, really inefficient. And you're going to cause a lot of other things to like not get what it needs, because we're trying to focus our attention. It's very calorically inefficient. That's why the brain's favorite thing to do in the world is habits, which is why I like my obsessive thing, because I can pick one new habit and obsess over it, and then I get the benefits of having that. But my brain enjoys that because it is an efficiency process. It's about how can I take this one thing that takes up so much real estate in my mind that I know is beneficial if I were to do this all of the time, and keep doing it until the amount of real estate that it takes is smaller and smaller and smaller. I don't know where I was going with that, but that was the end of that.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, it's one of the one of my favorite takeaways from Judaism is basically the art of elevating the mundane. So like in Orthodox Judaism, there's a prayer for almost everything, like putting on your right shoe, putting on your left shoe, putting on your belt, putting on your pants. There's a prayer for everything, for every single aspect of it. To the point where you just start cycling through, you're like, oh, what am I doing now? Oh, I'm going walking through a doorway, What's the prayer for that? And then you realize, like, this is the moment. This is like this. I'm about to walk through this doorway. This is actually one of the most important moments of my entire life. Everything's led up to me walking out of my bathroom door, and it's like a satori in Japanese Zen Buddhism. The way they describe it, it's like a aha movement. Like I left the bath. And it's in that moment you become like, there's no samskara, there's nothing. There's just your grace. You've taken the most mundane thing and made it everything,
Yep.
By virtue of habit, like what you're saying.
Yeah. The sacred is made of the mundane. There is nothing that isn't, to me anyway, there's nothing that's sacred that didn't originate mundane. Even if it was the mundane labor to build giant cathedrals and castles and stupas and just like all of it. It really is as simple as that. And I think with trauma, at least for me, when you carry that much pain and that much grief, you want something in the world to be the polarized version of that. There's so much pain and grief that you carry in your past that we look and expect that, like, a level of grandiosity and just extremes. And that's, that goes into everything from people like diving into being super Jesus or diving into super heroin.
The biggest temples in the world. One of my dear teachers, Atmananda Udasan, is an amazing teacher. I have so much to say about him, but he's also a Belgian man, so he has this wonderful French accent. He's a monk, I think 40 years as a monk in India now. And before that, 10 or 15 years as a Christian monk in Bethlehem. But anyway, he told me once in India, he's like, all this business, all this spiritual business, is always publish or perish. It's either you say something or you don't, and no one ever knows you existed.
Yeah.
But it comes back to, do I build a grand joie temple? Is that like the only way that my life has validity, that my teaching has validity, is if I make something insane and hyper-realistic version of this affirmation? Or do I die with it and no one ever hears it? The tree falls in the woods and no one was ever there.
Yeah. That's cool. 10 years as a Christian monk in Bethlehem and then decade. That's really cool. I bet that would be a really fun person to spend time with. That would be really neat.
He's the best. Honestly, if you ever have a chance to meet him, he's actually one of the most profound individuals I've ever had the pleasure of spending time with. He's someone who's genuinely just contemplated some wonderful thought processes. That's it. That's the whole game.
Yes. Yeah, I'm also very. Go ahead.
His line is, Maharshi Maharaj. I don't know if you know these guys from Tirumalai and Vedanta. The idea that it kind of like there's an adjacent to Zen Buddhism here, that the apex of the thought is to reach a place of what Zen Buddhists would call no mind, or in Vedanta you say non-reality. There's no reality, only that which isn't, what isn't is, that paradoxical lexicon, if you will.
Yep. There's who's doing it? A neurobiologist and speaker, and he's super famous now, but he's talking about the same thing, trying to get people to understand it through the language of the headless observer. That's what it was some teacher of his
Nice.
introduced him to the concept of the headless observer, and there's an app that they're doing, the waking up app, actually is what it's called, and there's quite a few weeks he really gets into this where it's almost like, okay, bro, we get it, but the guided meditations where he's constantly having people be like, okay, now, like, what are you experiencing, and now look for the thing that's experiencing it, and it's a very uncomfortable thing when you first sit down and do it. You're like, okay, looking for the observer, and you're like, okay, well, you have this sense of self because you're like in a body and you feel cold or warmth or gravity or like squishing or pressure or whatever. But anyway, that's a fun aside. I wanted to, before we get off, I wanted to talk to you about the book that you've already written and the one that you're writing now.
Yeah. So I've written quite a few books, but only one of them has met the light of day. That was a translation from Sanskrit to English of the Yoga Sutras. And my intention was that as I was studying them, starting 15 years ago, I couldn't find anything that was that could touch upon the same kind of lingua franca that you and me share through our experience defining what trauma is, for example, and also kind of like the sober sense, the sober interpretation of what yoga could be. Because you have on one side a lot of older books that say yogis can fly, they can move like light, they can pass through walls, and to me, it doesn't have to be so fantastic. It's actually very simple, very easy to understand truths there. For example, in the Yoga Sutras, it says the yogi, one of the siddhis, the great powers, is that you could transform into the body of any other being. But if you practice yoga practice, you may acquire a sense of empathy or a sense of disillusionment of the self that allows you to very easily be in the bodies of other people. And when you look at it that way, as a very practical sense of knowledge, that's very useful to use. And I didn't find any work that was sharing that. And I was having this download at the time while I was researching it and studying the Sanskrit. So I kind of wanted to share the experience, if it would be useful to anyone or not. So I just wrote it. It took me 4 years to write it.
Wow.
And published it into an app for iOS and Google Play stores, so everyone could download it and research it. You can hear me chanting the sutras if you want to learn how to chant them as well. So that was the book I wrote, and the book I'm writing is a little bit less academic. It's more of a humorous and mildly offensive interpretation of humanity's relationship with religion. So the joke is that it's the story of God as a woman who accidentally creates the universe and all of humankind. And then the book kicks off with humankind basically mansplaining her, telling her who she is, first of all, that she's a man, and what she or he enjoys, like virgin sacrifices, even though she never asked for that. Right. But they're like, clearly you would want that because
clearly, obviously,
you're you.
Yeah,
totally. So I play on a lot of very common tropes that we find in religious scripture, as well as religious culture, and the line between the affirmation to the mega church. How do we get there? And the thought process that goes into the path of hyperreality that we find in religion, all told through a mildly offensive, sometimes sexual story of God's evolution, of her basically finding herself through humans and humans finding themselves through God. And what that is like.
That's good. I'm so excited to read that. I am so excited to read that. If you need beta readers, send it my way. I'll be happy to. That's going to be really cool. Fun. That's going to be really fun. And what is the title? How can people find the book that did make it to the light of day?
It's called Yoga Katha, Yoga Sutras. So Katha means a story. So Yoga Katha, Yoga Stories, Yoga Sutras by Trip Om Shanti. That's me. And then the next book, I'm still searching for a title, but I think I'm probably going to call it The Heretic's Bible. And
Yes. Oh, I love that. I really, really love that. We still have time. I was just looking at, we still have time. So I've got a few more things I wanted to ask you. I wanted to make sure,
cool.
I wanted to talk about dissociation a little bit and what the Yoga Sutras can, what they're talking about with trauma, and is that even a concept that really shows up? I mean, because really, all we're talking about is escapism and trying to numb those imprints. What language is used to describe those types of events in the sutras?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's like very easily misinterpreted too when approaching the Yoga Sutras or any kind of Eastern philosophy, because to an escapist, that already is your predisposition. Once you start learning about Eastern religion, the whole thing just immediately sounds like escape Disneyland, basically. Oh, you're leaving your body. Oh, you're disconnecting. This is like the ketamine of religion. This is great, you know? But we have to be really careful because it really isn't. It's about engendering those qualities about ourselves to the point becoming super intimate with them. And that's why it's also suggested as an unbreakable aspect of the culture is that you have to have a living guru teach you these things. And this is the part, because without the guru, if you just have the teaching and the teaching alone, escapism is easy. Or if you have a teacher, let's say, that you just have for a couple of years and then you move to a different teacher, escapism is just it's perfectly simple. It's like, I read this, I am no mind, I am not this body, you know, or I am God, or I can practice this state of mind where I've let go of all things, you know. But if you have a guru, the guru will be like, no, you got to wash the dishes. Get off the meditation mat. Go take care of the house. You know, like, go do this, do that, do this. If you have kids, it's also the same thing too. So,
I was kind of wondering.
But yeah, because at first thought it seems very like escapist reality, but really the goal is to engender the you know, the emotional and physical world that we have, and then see the world through it, through the context that we are also beyond it, living in a greater context. So paradoxically, both worlds at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm no master of this concept at all.
No. You know, you were talking earlier about the way that you were interpreting the texts and of like being able to be in someone else's body. And when I hear that, my mind immediately goes to the exact same place that yours did, of like, it teaches empathy, you know, it teaches a lightness that they're, and the part of the reason, a friend of mine nailed this for me so well, in the UK, Flowers asked me one day, we were talking about Chinese medicine, and Flowers said, do you think people just don't take acupuncture seriously because it's just so poetic? And I just went, absolutely. Absolutely. When I talk about like your heart chi slackening and doing these, like it sounds so flowery and poetic. It can't possibly have any real effect on our health when we learn in the West our health from a purely biochemical perspective. And I feel like a lot of old teachings, the TCM is rich with them that are, and when you extend that out to religion, I think you get some of the most deep and profound and realistic understandings of what the original intentions were. Because for me, it takes a certain level of interest and comfortability and a depth of knowledge to even want to write about your religion, your understanding of the world, your perspectives and your viewpoints. And when you understand something so well and it brings you lightness and joy and peace and whatever, you wax poetically. It's a thing that we do. And when we are planning on the words that we write lasting for an undetermined amount of time into the future, we want not only the architecture of what we're saying, we also want it to be said. It's not about what we say, it's how we say it, right? But it's got to be both. And so when we're writing and discussing these things, whether it's from a Christian perspective or a yogic or a Chinese medicine or whatever, you're trying to both include the architecture, the basic message, the nuts and bolts schematics of how a thing works, and transmit the love that we have and the joy and the excitement and all of that, you know? And I think when I found Spinoza and the ethics, I was like, oh, this is like, I've had pieces of these thoughts all like throughout my life of like, maybe these things weren't meant literally, and if you take them metaphorically in some type of way, they suddenly make a lot more sense. And that's why I love Spinoza so much, Esperanza Spinoza, because he, or Barak, depending on which, like before or after he was exiled, from the freest country in the world at the time, it was like the 1640s, and the freest country in the world banned everything he ever wrote or would write by the time he was 24 years old. Because he wrote a book called The Ethics.
I didn't realize that. I didn't know that about him.
He wrote The Ethics, which was basically he was Jewish and his family were refugees. They wound up in the, a few different places, but he started writing.
The Netherlands, right?
Yeah, in the Netherlands. He started writing, trying to find and describe through pure logic, only through our conscious mind, what the most ethical way to be is, regardless of religion. What a
heretic.
Exactly. Exactly. And basically, and because like Euclidean math and geometry was all of the rage in the 1600s, he, as any good author does, starts the beginning of the Ethics with a list of definitions. And it's like, all right, if we're going to go through this, we need to understand what these things mean. And so he does a list of definitions, and then it's like a whole bunch of if-then statements, basically, until you get to, okay, well, if God is omnipotent, omniscient, like omnipresent, and all of these things, then what does that mean that God could be on a purely rational perspective? And his conclusion was, God is literally matter. Anything that is made up of matter in the universe is God. That is the only way it could be in all places, at all times, knowing all things, present to all things, observing all things. That's the only option. And so the statement that got him like ruined was, anytime that you say the word God, I can replace it with the word nature, and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence ever, and vice versa. That they are two things that are absolutely the same. And coming from
Would you find in other languages?
Yes, you do. I mean, for me, coming from a very, very religious household, especially my father with his associate's degree in Bible doctrine and theology, he was a absolute Bible thumper from the time I was raised. We used to mail Chick tracts. I don't know if anybody remembers Chick tracts, but they were these ridiculously in your face. Like there was like Holy Joe. There was a guy. He was a soldier. He went to war. He was in a foxhole and he got shot through the head and then goes to hell. And that's the Chick tract, is him going to hell and being burned alive and being like, for eternity, being like, I wish I would have believed in Jesus. And it's like, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of these, and these are what we used to mail out as children to every single house in all of these different towns around our area. We eventually covered every single house in all of Indiana at one point, apparently. So I come from a very, very, very religious home. And at one point, toward the end of my high school, the only person my father wouldn't argue doctrine with was me, because I showed up to class in high school, to my hour-and-a-half study hall, with my King James and my Newer International Version and my Strong's Concordance and my Matthew Henry commentaries, and I dug through and was still, these were all I was really trying to figure stuff out, because I'm still trying to pray the gay away, but I'm also trying to prove there was so many things. It was very interesting, and I had a huge chip on my shoulder about Christianity for ages because of that, because of my father and all of the sins that he hid behind his religion. And when I found Spinoza, it all clicked in this very practical way that you're talking about of going, okay, well, what does this mean? Maybe it doesn't have to be so fantastical. Maybe it is as fantastical as that. I leave room for that as well. But maybe it doesn't have to be so fantastical, and maybe things can be really, really, really simple. And so now, through the lens that I gained through Spinoza, I haven't found since then a religion or worldview or perspective that doesn't fit in perfectly. There is no worldview or perspective that is not congruous with mine. And that frees me up so much to actually be present, to actually be empathetic, to actually be paying attention, instead of getting my dander up because we're disagreeing on something, and because of that I miss the next point or two that somebody has to say. I really think
I totally agree. It's sobriety.
It is. It is
sobriety of spirituality. My father was an alcoholic, and he would run to the Bible in order to kind of heal him. And it did actually help him relieve himself of his alcohol addiction. However, it's kind of like trading one for the other. Even though Christianity is inherently an alcoholic beverage,
right?
You can make it into one.
Oh, yeah.
And you could drink it, and you could become just as drunk and just as non-functional to your family and to the world around you through consuming it. And what you're consuming is not Christianity, even though you're in the church and reading the Bible, you're doing all the steps. You're actually filtering everything that's coming into you and brewing it into a hallucinogenic. And you're intoxicated by it. And you see that with a lot of people who choose the path of spirituality. Religion is like a hospital. So it's very easy to look at a hospital and say, look at all these sick people, Yeah. The community is normally the majority of anyone I have to work with in a spiritual community is there because they're running from something. And they're more likely to want the intoxicating version of the practice. Even though that's not what the practice is, that's not what should be consumed. And I think your story and my story are very similar in that we came to the same sources that our fathers had. But we don't want to take the hallucinogenic version of the intoxicating version. We want to make it sober, keep my feet on the ground. I could still come to the same conclusion.
And I think that comes full circle to the conversation of the mundane. I think that's why there's so much wisdom in the religions that I don't describe to. I think are some of the most intelligent, thoughtful, wonderful, marvelous things that have ever been invented, because they do give you a chance, especially with a guru. And I talk about that a bit in the book too, of we have a hard time in the West with meditation because there's a lot of reasons, but the wisdom of having a prayer for your right foot and having a prayer for your left shoe and having a prayer for the threshold. It seems so freaking ridiculous on the surface. But then when you think about what the impact of it is, ignore the pedantic process. What's the impact of that pedantic process? And the impact of that process is constant awareness of yourself in time and space, which we call just being present.
Yeah.
You know, and
which could be sober, and it should be. Or you could be like your sense of presence comes because you're on something, you know, whether an actual you took something or you're tuning into a state of mind that is basically your form of escapism. You know, like for my father, Christianity was a form of escapism until he found genuine Christianity over time.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear you found genuine Christianity. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, it was an interesting story. It took him, I think, 47 years, and then the last 2 years, then he passed away.
Wow. Okay. Wow. It's his life accomplishment. Finally figured it out. Hey, you know, that's not bad. That ain't bad as far as I'm concerned. Figuring out whatever it is that allows you to move through the world with a little bit of peace and grace. Like, if you can figure that out by the time you die, you did a pretty good job.
Amen. Amen to that, brother.
Seriously.
Amen to that, brother.
Seriously. Like, I recognized how how privileged I am to have had so much time alone, even if most of that time was like homeless and living on the streets as a musician, to have so much time to think, to really, really think, you know?
Totally.
And most people
100% agree with you there.
Yeah, most people are taking care of kids and like working dead-end jobs, and like there's just, life has so much. And then we have an endless supply of dirt cheap, really expensive entertainment. As far as like, it's cheap for us, but it takes like $8 million for your like average movie nowadays, you know? But like with so much to do and so much demanding our attention, I really feel like, as high-minded as I like to be and perceive myself occasionally, as far as like being very cerebral that way, I mean, it's really important to remember, for me, what the baseline is. And for me, I would go back to the baseline for me as a human being is naked and afraid in the jungle. That's the baseline. Anything above that is like pretty dope. You know, for most of like human existence, we definitely didn't have what we have now. And I'm doing really well. And if we can just find a way that makes us live a bit more peacefully, a bit more soberly, I think that's a really good goal to have, to move through life with. And if we can figure that out by the time we die, good on us. Good on your dad.
Amen. Yeah. All right, my brother, I better get going. It's kind of late where I am.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you. It was really wonderful talking with you. Thank you so much, sharing your time and sharing your expertise with me. I really appreciate it. You have a wonderful night, and I will speak with you soon. And I'm really looking forward to that next book. One last time, where can people find your book that's already out and available?
It's on Amazon. Just search for Yoga Katha, Yoga Sutras, Katha, if you're wondering how to spell Katha. And then, we'll see about the next one. We'll see where it ends up.
All right. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful night.
Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope that you got something out of this conversation. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.